Hello, good evening, welcome. Tonight on the David Ellis Report, we are talking to David Banks, leading defence policy researcher and Brexit campaigner. David, you've been saying that we have a problem with the defence industry production and procurement rules. So just talk us through, what's this all about?
Well, it's about an EU directive called the EU Defence and Security Procurement Directive, which created a law in the UK called DSPCR, the Defence and Security Public Contracts Regulations. That's the complicated bit out of the way. What it does, in a roundabout way, is that it tells the UK government to go for international competition for its defence equipment, except in narrow cases where the government is allowed to use an exemption for two main reasons: for government-to-government contracts, such as those with the US on things like nuclear and the F-35Bs, and for secrecy, for preserving secret technology, for things like the nuclear submarines. The problem with this is that the exemptions are so narrow that the government normally, in most cases, has to go to international competition. And the way that that works and the way that the markets work and shipbuilding in the UK works, normally it would mean that shipbuilding contracts are lost from the UK when we can't protect them by this security exemption. And so things like the support ships that are being spoken about at the moment, and the contracts are coming up, they're going to be issued. A notice for those contracts is going to be issued soon. It's likely that that will be lost to a foreign shipyard.
Wow, and that's something I don't think anybody would like to see. And I think that the conversations that I've had, particularly on this subject with Admiral Roger Lane, not a lot of the old guard, are saying that we need to retain this sovereign capability. So this is a crucial aspect of not just Brexit and leaving the EU, but our own sovereign capability to produce our own warships here in the UK. So this is a story really about keeping shipbuilding contracts in the UK, which we were talking about with Lord West last week. And that steady drumbeat that he's mentioned in committee about that the production there for British industry and manufacturing and those small to medium companies here that are involved with it. So everyone's asking ministers to see sense, but what you're saying is it's not actually a minister's choice, but down to an EU rule to decide what can be kept here in the UK and what can't be.
That's right. And the reason they're misinterpreting this rule is that it changed fairly recently. It only happened in the last few years. And people think, and when I say people, I mean pretty much every official that you might want to speak to, every MP and pundit, defence pundits who think they know all the rules, they're absolutely convinced that these ships can be preserved for UK shipyards if we only reclassify them as warships. But there is nothing in the EU rule that speaks specifically about warships. If they had secret technology on the hull of the warships, then fine. But that is not a way in which we can keep these contracts in the UK. So the rule is being misunderstood. People are interpreting the rule on the basis of what they knew about the rules in the 2000s. But things have moved on because the directive was imposed on the UK in 2011. And it was through several examples of EU case law that we came to learn by about 2014 that it is actually a very restrictive rule where you can't just say that's a sovereign capability and therefore let's keep it in the UK, because ultimately the people who award these contracts in Whitehall will know that that will be tested in the EU courts and they will lose, and so they have to get it right.
This is an enormous issue, really, considering the volumes of British taxpayers' money involved, potentially with putting out to contract for Royal Navy, Fleet Auxiliary, or warships, or let's say even we go further into other platforms. So this is something really where I've got to fundamentally raise some sort of serious questions that this cannot really be be left to simply as a misunderstanding, because that frankly just is not good enough. So what you're saying is that this problem doesn't come to an end when the transition period finishes on the 31st of December.
That's right. Yeah. And the
Wow.
reason why it doesn't come to an end is that it is UK law. The EU directive had its way. It changed UK law, and that UK law is there's no plan to change it at the moment. It will stay as retained EU law, and until MPs change it, then the contract awards will take place in exactly the same way. But MPs don't know. It seems like they don't know enough about the problems of this law in order to want to change it.
But there's got. I mean, this is a subject we covered with Lord Essos last week. That really, this is a crossbench matter really, because it's a national issue, and it's a national capability, and that industry and those jobs and skills are all vital for the nation. So whether that's Labour, Tory, Liberal, or SNP, or Welsh. All of these MPs have to understand that this concerns them and their constituents directly, one way or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right. Unfortunately, what often comes up in the conversation is the Leave Remain divide.
Yeah.
And there is a tendency for people across the political spectrum, across the traditional party spectrum, to protect EU law, and even deny that it has a bad effect when it really does.
Yeah.
And so it's difficult even to get into those conversations. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I can concur with the reluctance here of MPs. I mean, obviously, you and I have both spent a lot of time in Parliament lobbying on defence issues. And my basis was that I didn't want to, I was vehemently opposed to the defence cuts as they were pitched politically, but I never believed that was the case. It was a question of unifying the military and the industry. But the reluctance of the MPs to engage and the lack of drive to take this into a political public debate is not going to be healthy. It's not something that we can do, because you've just said there that it's the MPs that have got to bring about a law change in order for us to get out of what's a really serious problem. A problem I wouldn't see happening in Russia or China or America, and yet we've got it here. And this is a legal issue first, then a policy to then go into industry.
Yeah, that's it. There is an additional complicating factor besides the Leave Remain split, which is that defence industry, as we'll know, as you'll know, is very influential in the construction of these laws. And they've become sold on the idea that having this law as it stands at the moment in alignment with the EU directive gives them the chance in future to sell into the EU industrial base, the EU defence market. And that is a flawed premise, because what it really does is that it severs the UK defence industry's link with the biggest defence equipment budget in Europe, which is the one that belongs to the MOD. So they're losing in one hand and then claiming to be gaining, or hoping to gain, in the other, when this magical defence industry market opens up to them, which actually is unlikely to materialise.
I'm in complete agreement with that, and I've got to say this is probably the moment where we bring in Ursula von der Leyen, who has stated in terms, so this former German defence minister, and now with the highest office essentially in the EU, that's driven a lot of the European Defence Union agenda, that she has stated in terms that she wants one single European defence contractor that would be single point defence procurement and production, innovation, the whole 9 yards for everything to do with this, with the production of any capital expenditure. So she'll control the budget as well as the policy and who gets what. So just what's your take on that gambit, where British companies like Rolls-Royce, BAE, Babcock, and all the others that follow on from their shirt tails with what was MOD procurement? There's got to be some kind of impact there that this is, and there's an overlap with this law, surely.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a link, because the EU directive was brought in order to be the foundation for what the EU calls EDTIB, the European Defence Technological and Industrial Base. And EDTIB started to be spoken about more seriously about 4 or 5 years ago. And now it's a crucial pillar of everything EU defence. It is the industrial component of the integration project that they're undertaking. The reason that the directive is crucial to the defence technological and industrial base of the EU is that it provides the EU with the basis on which to supervise the whole defence, the EU's defence industrial market. And this is a project of stealth and slow creeping growth, as we normally see with other EU, what I would call power grabs. It's a pervasive, gradual inflow of influence.
Yeah.
And so in 10 years' time, it'll look completely different to what it is now. But already we've got the beginnings. I mean, more than the beginnings. We're a decade really down the line of this integration of EU defence industries.
Yeah.
I mean, probably more than a decade. I think I've read some of the stuff that you and your colleagues have written about how it goes way back, because some of the leaders, if you like, of the EU project knew how important defence industry was to their project.
Yeah, I think something that we broached, that we've broached with a couple of the senior officers, and I've certainly broached it with a lot of MPs that I spoke to, was that the versioning policy came in with the 57 Panavia project of building fast jets on a pan-European basis. So that's really the start, let's say, the beginnings of the gambit to do defence and defence industry on an EU basis. But of course, the pitch here in the UK at the time was that they wanted single point procurement, which ended up being BAE as we know it now. But what we're seeing is we've gone from a pitch of this will be a cheaper way of doing it. I'm sure you've heard that many times, with the EU circles, that this will be a better way of doing it. We'll have more, it will be cheaper, and it will cure all these problems. And of course, that never really transpired with the Sandys paper of doing fast jets on an EU basis, because the other thing we were promised, and it's highly poignant with where we're going with this, was missiles. We were promised missiles as a result as well of it, that would be, this is where we need to go with the technology and the development. And of course, what we ended up with, David, was neither really.
Yeah.
So if anything, that there was a benchmark for the politicians to realise that this gambit of, it will be cheaper doing it like this, and the companies thinking that they're going to get defence contracts. It's a double whammy, obviously. It's a really good sales pitch, but it's not.
Absolutely.
It's not sincere.
It isn't. No, you're absolutely right. And the people who dream up these schemes for integration of defence industries across Europe only need to say one thing to persuade member state governments to go with it, and that is cost saving. Yeah. And the cost saving assumptions and the sales pitch around that is never quantified and evaluated, because then they would just be holding up a rod for their own backs. It's just quietly forgotten when they finally get round to sealing the deal. And so no one ever goes back and says, well, what about those cost savings? What about those missiles? What about this greater capability and strategic uplift? It never happens.
Yeah, I think this is obviously, this is the mantra that they would probably want to hear in the Treasury and in government. it will be cheaper. Great, okay, tick. The politics is easy at that stage because they can pitch it to the public. And of course, the MOD, oh, it'll be cheaper. Great, so everybody's on board. But actually, the reality, and this is something I've really got to thank Admiral Lord West for highlighting last week, was that the reality for the nation is it is extremely expensive to go down this road.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because when the UK loses a 1.5 billion shipbuilding contract, we're also having to support potentially a lot of those people who would otherwise have been employed in the shipyards.
Yeah.
Benefits, training that they haven't received, the supply chain that is just completely deleted.
Yes.
The spending and income tax that those workers will be able to feed back into the system. Yeah. It's a systemic knock that comes from giving away our own defence contracts and just erasing them just because we want to be compliant with somebody else's rules. It just doesn't make any sense.
It does not make any sense. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with that because I saw it firsthand, the impact on ability to produce good quality engineered production in the Midlands around Coventry when Rolls-Royce shut Anstey as a result of the review in 2010, was that so many family businesses went to the wall because of that, because they fed in and out of Rolls-Royce and they were no longer able to carry on in business. What we lost was the skills, we lost the supply chains, we lost the ability to make things quickly and cheaply, because when those companies go to the wall, the ones that are left put their prices up. Yeah. Because there are less of them. Yeah. So this is if ever there was a point to put a flag down in the ground now over this law that we've got that's going to actually dictate defence policy in Britain and defence manufacturing, a vital state asset. Now is really the time for people to be digging in and having a good go at this. Would you agree?
I would, absolutely. And you only need to look at Canada as an example of a country which had this problem. And just like the UK now, it's our own choice as to whether we keep this law or not. And in Canada, they had a problem where they were just taking expedient decisions to build a ship here and a ship there and to send it to South Korea or the States or some other country to have it built. And they realized that they were losing skills, investment, jobs, and the prospect of being a serious shipbuilding country. So they took a grip of it a few years back. And now, after a few sort of lost leader contracts, Canada is back on a solid footing as a serious shipbuilder. They've got two big shipbuilding companies involved in their national shipbuilding policy. One is for non-defense stuff, one is for defense stuff. And even though half of the, some of, I won't say exactly 50%, but some of this national shipbuilding strategy is for non-military shipbuilding, it is still included in the defense and security exemption from WTO rules. Now that exemption, unlike the EU version, is much wider. Yep. And so the Canadians can build their Coast Guard ships, their logistics and support ships, patrol ships, all in Canada using that exemption. Yep. And they've never regretted it. And that's a 30 billion plus Canadian dollar project, employing thousands of people.
David, that is absolutely fantastic because that is exactly the benchmark that would be sensible for us to be running in Britain. So on that note, what's your message to Ben Wallace and the defence ministers? And Ben is now the shipbuilding czar. So what do we need to be saying to Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State?
I think he needs to use his ability to listen, and I think sometimes he does listen. And he's a good politician. When he was a security minister, he was brilliant on detail, and he needs to get back to that because at the moment he's listening to people who've been running the same story for years and years. Yeah. Which is, don't worry, Minister, we can choose to get around these rules, but it's just that at this moment we're not choosing to. And it's not the case. It's a deception. If only he were to listen and take a minute, granular look at the way that these rules, informed by the directive, hurts British shipbuilding. If only he were to say, look, whatever rules we've got, we need to make it possible to take our own choices in this country. And the choice that we take is to have this shipbuilding done at home.
Absolutely.
That's what he needs to do.
Absolutely, because you know this gambit that we're leaving the EU and we want to take back control, and yet it seems, you know, from the research that you've done here, and I've got the hard copies in front of me, that one of the things that we're not going to be taking back control of is defence and defence industry thereof. So this absolutely smacks in the face. So I think this is something that, you know, and I think you're right earlier on in the discussion to highlight leave and remain. Because actually, this is something that both points of view need to take on board, because it affects what's happening here to our own people and jobs and skills here in Britain.
Yeah, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes I try to be a bit understanding to the Remain mindset. And listening to Remainers before and after the referendum, one thing they always said was that they were keen to retain sovereignty, and sometimes they denied that the EU had any effects on UK sovereignty. But if both sides can unite on the fact that UK sovereignty and sovereign decision-making, strategic defence, industrial decision-making are all important, then that should be a win-win. That should be something that the Secretary of State can work with. But the crucial thing for him, once he's understood the rules, is to change them, because without changing them, we can't do things our own way.
Yeah, we're not going to resolve this. And that hope that we would see in this defence review coming up, the integrated review, of some strategic vision for what's going to be what we're going to do in the country over the next decades, then unless we address this, there's going to be a severe impact.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
and it's billions of pounds.
Oh, the volumes of money are ginormous potentially, because we know very well that the Navy and the Army and the Air Force have to modernise. You know, this is academic now. They have to modernise. The platforms have to be brought up to date. Some of them are hopelessly out of date, which I was very privileged to sort of sit behind General Sir Richard Barron's in Defence Committee when he's articulated all this perfectly, that, you know, a lot of this stuff is not fit for purpose. And he's right. You know, I'm happy to rely on what he says as the, you know, as a senior officer. So just to sum this up, what's your sort of message to the general public out there? How do we, you know, what do we have to do? How do we get behind actually pushing the MPs to do something about this?
I think, do you know what? It would be really useful if people were to speak to their MPs about this and make it clear to the MPs that they're not getting the right kind of information about it. They're getting outdated information. They're getting stuff that was dreamt up or developed in the 2000s. And they need really informed information and advice from not the normal sources. And so if people were to write to their MPs about this and say, look, don't listen to the EU-funded trade unions on this, who think that the EU directive and the resulting UK rule is just something we can sidestep. Don't listen to the normal defence punditry about this, who are often backed by defence industry. But instead, listen to people who have got a deep concern about saving jobs. And take another look at it. If people were to write to their MPs just to say, look, there's something going amiss here, and please take another look, then I think it would go a long way. Now, just to my point there about defence industry and pundits, a lot of commentators in this particular sphere are backed by defence industry, and you can't blame them, because that's the only way they're going to make a living. But what tends to happen is that they then get their lead from those companies and what the companies want to hear. And the policy, the political policy, tends to come fed via those defence companies. And the world of defence lobbying and defence policy creation is quite a small one. And what tends to happen is that the companies become influenced by a few key people, either in Brussels or in Westminster, who have a vested interest in keeping the rules as they are, normally a political vested interest, because they want to keep the UK aligned to the EU. And so the defence companies just follow suit, even though it's against their best interests. And that just trickles through to defence punditry and MPs and others. So unfortunately, the whole of the conversation has become taken over by a myth that this EU defence procurement rule that we have on the UK statute books can just be sidestepped. And it's utterly ridiculous. Nobody seems to say it about any other EU directive, that it can just be ignored, because it's not the case. But in this one, it's really gained traction, and people need to look at MPs who want to really look at the detail, need to find out how they think that their impression of the rule stacks up with the reality. If they took a bit of time, I think they'd get to know the reality.
Yeah, and this is something that really this needs resolving. Otherwise, we're going to be left with a severe handicap and a legacy that the EU have planted in, even though we think we've left.
Absolutely. And there's another risk as well to the economic risk and the loss of jobs. That is the fact that this directive is a bridge to further projects that the EU is developing.
Yeah.
So let me put that another way. The EU has been trying to get us into their integration structures in defence. But they don't call them integration structures, they call it cooperation or something else warm and cuddly that we won't object to.
Yes.
The only way they'll get us into those structures is for us to keep the EU directive intact on our statute books. And that's why there's a bitter fight by those people in Whitehall who want to stay aligned with the EU on everything, including defence, to keep this rule in place. So as you'll see and as you'll know, there's so many strands to this problem. In order for a minister or MPs to get a grip of it, they need to be aware of all of them and tackle them.
Yeah. Well, what you're describing really is they're leaving an anchor to drag us back in. And of course, the first thing that's going to happen is once they initiate a project where the innovation is their end, not ours, we will automatically be pulled back in.
Yeah, that's it. And that brings us back to Ursula von der Leyen and what you said earlier about how she's one of the key characters behind the EU defence architecture and the growth of military EU. And I can probably, having thought about it a bit more, I can probably answer that point a bit clearer. The link between the EU directive and the EU's defence architecture is that the EU knew that it had to cripple or disable the link between member state defence equipment budgets and domestic industry in order for the EU to have a chance to be the principal supervisor of those industries together. And so that's why they brought in the directive. And once they've got that integrated defence industry, it's far more easy for them then to advance the project of defence political integration, that is the joint working and even joint badging of EU capabilities and units, alongside the integration of defence industry. And of course, the two go hand in hand, because at the end of the day, being able to defend yourself comes down to money and technological capability.
That's absolutely right. I think this is a substantial data point that you've highlighted there, because in order to unify the military itself in defence union, that von der Leyen has articulated, she's stated this in terms that what she wants is a genuine European defence union. And that fundamentally the way that they would do that is that they would all have the same equipment. And she stated this in terms at numerous press releases where we wanted just one European helicopter, one European fighter, one European frigate, or one European armoured vehicle, so that anybody from any nation could get in or out of it, command it, run it and operate it and maintain it, that there would be no national barriers, i.e. no sovereignty amongst any of those nation states that go into defence union. So, it comes back to, again, this fundamental that we're leaving the EU, but actually, unless this is resolved, are we really?
Absolutely, absolutely. And these are the sort of tethers, the sort of the ropes binding the ship of the UK to the port.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're absolutely right. And for anyone who, I'm sure that most of your audience is quite well informed on these things, but anyone who doubts what you've just said about defence union, military integration, perhaps they haven't followed it, perhaps they watch the UK media, which doesn't pay any attention to it, then I've got a really choice anecdote for you and for them, which is when I listened to someone from the European External Action Service, which is the foreign and defence branch of the EU, speaking about defence union. A guy called Arnaud Molenaar, a Dutchman. He said that if you have, as we are getting, we as in EU, a joint weapon, and you are using it jointly, if you're developing it jointly, if you're funding it jointly, and all of that is done under a policy that is integrated, then yes, you have a defence union. And that was a couple of years ago now. I think it was the beginning of last year. And that was fascinating to hear that, because that was just a couple of weeks before a much more decisive admission from the European Commission that defence union was real and here. It wasn't just a forward-looking aspiration. And then fast forward to this week, and we have the European External Action Service articles and papers about, hey, defence union, here's where we are. So they're giving regular updates, and they change the lexicon as time goes on. When they're more prepared to admit things because they've got it all sealed in the political agreements, then they start to wheel out the language. And that's what we're starting to see more and more. Defence union is real. You go to Brussels and everyone's talking about it. At least they were up until last year.
Yeah.
But have you noticed?
Go on.
Well, I was going to say, have you noticed that the talk around EU defence arrangements and agreements has gone a little bit off the boil? It's probably partly due to COVID, but I think that the big reason we don't hear as much about EU agreements in defence is that they've got everything that they need in the way of political military agreements for the next few years. Up until it was about October, November 2019, that the last bit of the EU defence architecture was put in place. It's the most recent one, I should say, not the last one, because there's more to come, but the most recent one, which was to do with the CSDP compact for civilian participation in EU defence interventions. And this was in an EU Council meeting last year. Most MPs wouldn't know about this because they've not been told, because they've never followed it. But I have, you have, and other people have. But since then, that was the last piece of the jigsaw they wanted to create prior to 2020. And now what we have for the next few years is just permanent structured cooperation, those 40-odd projects, whatever it is, rolling on and developing and creating new binds, new budgetary and military and command and capability binds between the member states. The European Defence Fund is ratcheting up, and its influence and its budget is being deployed. European Defence Agency, as the secretariat of both of those schemes, is developing, is scaling up. I could go on. The MPCC, the Military Planning and Conduct Capability, this is the military HQ of the EU, is growing in terms of its personnel and its funding and its political capability, and it's doing exercises and practicing how it might intervene. So the EU military architecture is right there. It's growing and it's working in the background. So none of the politicians need to talk about it anymore until such point that they want to make it a bit more formal. and a bit more public. And I think that's what we'll see in probably 2024, 25.
Yeah.
And we might even see a new EU treaty specifically on military.
Just in conclusion then, David, the bill for all this, because they've got obviously grand aspirations not just to be an empire that's fully armed. That's not going to come for free. So what do you envisage the quantities of money and the tax bill ultimately that's going to be for the general public for all of this equipment that they're going to invest in?
It's we can be sure that it's massive, because they're already lining themselves up with comparisons with the US and China. They're claiming to be the third biggest defense player in the world already by budget, by combining all the EU member states together. And certainly until recently, they might still be doing it. They were including the UK's defense budget in that, at least up until last year.
So
whenever
alarm bells, everyone. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we know that it's big, but I hesitate on the financial numbers, because it's actually more than the budgets that you see written down. So the European Defence Fund is something like, I think, 8 to 10 billion. I haven't quite kept track, but the power of the European Defence Fund is far bigger because of the political power that it wields through other mechanisms over the member state budgets, which are further billions.
Yeah.
So yeah, I certainly agree that there is a bill to pay. If the UK was involved, there'd be a direct contribution. There'd be a bill to pay in the number of contracts, defence contracts, and jobs that we lose overseas.
Yeah.
And there's also a bill in terms of the political accountability that we'd be losing if we were a part of any of this. And it's like a spider's web. You touch one bit and you're trapped.
It all reacts.
Because you find that you've actually signed up to other bits later on.
Yeah. I mean, I probably just want to bring in for the purposes of discussion, and potentially, just to open up the debate and bring an end to this silence. That so I'm posing this as a question, if they were going to go on that gambit of being a genuine, as the Germans called it, defence union, and they were going to be talking about 2%, if we were going to use the NATO benchmark on defence spending. So 2% of the GDP of Europe equates to something like 600 billion euros. So this is the magnitude of money that we could potentially, for the sake of an argument, be talking about.
Right. Yeah.
So for an MP to now start taking notice that currently is this ratchet mechanism that they've got with the industry, that if we carry on allowing that ratchet to pull us in, that could potentially be the ultimate destination, is that kind of volume of money.
Yeah.
And whether that would include a nuclear deterrent or nuclear capability, these are the questions we need to ask.
Yeah.
As a superpower, it would have to be nuclear armed, otherwise it won't work.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are UK pundits and academics who say that UK nuclear capability and French nuclear capability were already under the ambit of EU common security and defence policy, technically speaking, and certainly under the remit of the EU's mutual defence clause, 42.7, I think it is, off the top of my head, article of the Lisbon Treaty. So yes, I think it's very worrying. And once the EU defence budget, or the collective firepower, is at that kind of scale, 600 billion, then it's certainly at a level with the US and others, and it would have then a magnetic effect, drawing in nearby states. The Norwegians are already under common security and defence policy, and so yes, it's inevitably going to be including the nuclear.
It would be a gravity. It would be a defence gravity well. So let's just conclude this in terms of from a general public's perspective. as what would directly concern people in Britain at the moment is comments that we've got from the current German Defence Minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, where she's talking about conscription on a pan-EU basis, 16 to 35, both sexes. What do you think the British general public are going to make of that?
I think we're certainly not going to want to be a part of that. I think a professional armed forces has distinguished the UK. I think that if we were even to dip our toes into the defence industrial games of the EU, we'd get ourselves trapped into much wider arguments and structures and schemes, which could end up with us being a part of those other conversations about joint capabilities. So, yeah, I think people should sit up and take notice of what the EU is doing and be aware that it is already a military entity and a growing one. And people should, I think, and the politicians in particular, need to think about what a military EU does to NATO. Yeah. Because all of a sudden you're turning NATO from a US-led organization where everyone else does their best, or some of them, to fall in behind. Yeah. And it turns it into a polarized organization where you have the US and EU eyeing each other over the table, saying, well, who's making the decisions?
Yeah, I think you're right to highlight that polarization, because they are two completely different concepts. NATO as a concept and the European Defence Union are completely different concepts, and they're not similar in any way, shape, or form.
No, and you can go all the way back to the EU's Balkan intervention in the 1990s, and look at what they did there. The first thing that any EU official said about that was, "This is Europe's moment." You know, it was an ideological stunt for them. No one can treat foreign intervention and peacekeeping as a means of establishing an ideological gain at home. Yeah. It's completely wrong, and it's certainly incompatible with the way that the UK and US do things. So that's a warning, and they're still doing it all the way to this day, even though their intervention in the Balkans was a disaster and then had to be taken over by NATO, the UN, and everyone else.
David Banks, thank you very much indeed.